I'm Alicia Wanless. I run the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I'm going to be sharing a little bit about what we've learned in looking at this topic over the last couple of years. This is not going, though. So what I want to tell you is share some of the things that we've been researching. First thing is, what's the problem? Democracies around the world have been struggling to address an immediate existential crisis in coronavirus. And there would be a lovely slide here if it goes, yes, what's the problem? Okay, here we're going. I'm going to start. So, democracies have been struggling to respond to coronavirus, which is an immediate existential crisis. How do we expect to actually address climate change when we are having problems with public decision making? And why is this the case? Mostly because we have a polluted information environment in which people can manipulate things and public opinion. The information environment is the space where humans and machines produce and share information to make sense of the world. Information can include things like ideas, songs, codes, images, and it moves through the information environment through different channels. That includes social media, but also television, radio, print, websites, and in person. And little is really known about how that information environment actually works as a system. Now, savvy actors, as most of us know, will attempt to influence audiences and outcomes through things like influence operations. And this tends to happen in a cyclical model with the ultimate aim of engaging audiences to become participants in that and spread the propaganda as well. Enter the PCIO. So we are an international multi-stakeholder community of about 31 partners of academics, industry, government, and other donors. And our aim is really to foster evidence-based policymaking to counter threats within the information environment. Since 2020, when we launched in January, we started out by conducting a bunch of meta-studies to really understand who was doing what to counter influence operations, and how much did we really understand about their effects and the efficacy of impact of interventions to them. So this is very brief on what we learned. First, defining the problem is hard. Olga will appreciate this very much. A lot of definitions are used, mostly inconsistently, from field to field and even in the same field sometimes. It's a big emerging field. We identified 460 initiatives last year. The majority are focusing on fact-checking or supporting journalism or some form of research. And, okay, the experts do, fortunately, agree mostly on next steps, and that tends to come down to sharing more information, regulating tech companies, greater transparency. And platforms are making more tweaks, but these tweaks to the platforms tend to be focused on redirecting users to better information or content labeling. Governments have also seized the opportunity with COVID, yes, now I've got 5 minutes, to implement laws to counter aspects of influence operations. So what are the gaps? First up, we talk about a whole of society solution, but we don't really have the glue bringing it together. There isn't an obvious field to speak of. There's no key leading institute that I could recommend that somebody would go and learn about the information environment. A lot of the convening is ad hoc. And if you look at the different stakeholders who have to come together, it's difficult, they don't trust each other, and they're not really talking. Just to give some example on the resources that are required, we take an 8C step to change, and that involves building that community, convening them, and finding answers and moving that forward. One of the reasons we don't have this glue is because operational funding is lacking, and the community tends to agree with this. A lot of it's project-based, so we get a lot more case studies than anything else. And there's a lack of diversity in the field. The majority of it is in North America and Europe. Most of the proposals that come out don't have the details for industry or government to implement, so this is also problematic. We don't really know what to do. And little is known about the threat. So we don't know much about the effects of influence operations, mostly only in the context of mass media. Very little is known about the long-term effects using digital media, and we don't know much about Western populations. We know even less about the efficacy of interventions. 8% of the interventions we looked at that companies disclosed, only 8% mentioned efficacy with no further details of whether it worked or not. That leaves massive gaps in things like what happens when we deplatform people, what happens when we do content moderation. Why do we know so little? Comes down to a lack of transparency reporting. Researchers just don't know what research is available, so they don't even know what to ask for. We don't have data sharing rules, so nobody really knows who should have access to what data, for what purposes, and who gets to decide that. And then on top of that, even if we had those things worked out, we don't have a mechanism for longer-term research to facilitate knowing more about interventions that would protect the independence of researchers. So what to do? A networked problem needs a networked solution. So every stakeholder really needs to come together and do things. Civil society should be convening to come up with some of these answers to determine who gets access to what data and on what terms. Academia should come together and instead of being separate centers, work on having bigger infrastructure to do bigger testing like on interventions. Government should be regulating transparency reporting and data sharing rules. Obviously, civil society should be giving them some answers there, but they should also look at funding something like a CERN for the information environment, something that is multi-stakeholder, industry can fund, donors can fund, and researchers can go and learn more. Platforms don't have to wait for governments. They could start to do greater transparency reporting today, but they should also be continuing to work with researchers, ideally on good faith, maintaining their independence. And finally, donors can support that glue and that multi-stakeholder need that we have to have a whole of society solution. And with that, I will not have any more tech failures. Thank you.